It was an ordinary day at the hospital. Nurses hurried down the hallways, doctors reviewed patient charts, and the faint beeping of monitors echoed in the background. Everyone was busy, as they always were, with their own tasks and routines. But that calm was shattered in an instant when a commotion erupted near the main entrance. A security guard's voice, tinged with both confusion and fear, crackled over the intercom. "There's a lion in the lobby." At first, no one believed it. A lion? Here? It sounded absurd. Some thought it might be a prank. Others assumed it was a misunderstanding, but curiosity quickly turned into panic as more staff rushed to the entrance to see for themselves. And there it was, an enormous lion, standing tall and regal in the middle of the hospital's reception area. Its golden mane seemed to glow under the fluorescent lights, and its piercing amber eyes scanned the room. But that wasn't the strangest part. Cradled gently in its massive jaws was a small, swaddled baby. The lion moved slowly and deliberately, almost as if it understood the chaos it was causing. Patients gasped, some nurses froze in place, and a few staff members hurried to lock nearby doors. But nobody dared get too close. In the midst of the chaos, one nurse, Sarah, stood rooted to the spot. She wasn't the most senior staff member, nor was she the bravest, but something about the lion's demeanor caught her attention. It wasn't growling, roaring, or acting aggressive. In fact, it looked calm, determined, even. The baby in its jaws didn't appear to be in distress either. Its tiny face was visible, and Sarah could have sworn she saw it move. Despite her pounding heart, Sarah took a cautious step forward. "Call animal control," someone shouted behind her, but she didn't flinch. Instead, she focused entirely on the lion. "It's okay," she whispered, as much to herself as to the animal. "Everything's going to be okay." The lion turned its head slightly, and for a moment, Sarah locked eyes with it. There was something in its gaze, something profound, almost human. She couldn't explain it, but it was as if the lion was trying to tell her something. The room seemed to hold its breath as Sarah took another step forward. "Sarah, don't," a colleague hissed, but she ignored the warning. She could feel her hands trembling, but she kept going, her instincts guiding her. "It's all right," she said softly, her voice steady despite the fear bubbling inside her. "I'm here to help." The lion tilted its head, then gently placed the baby on the floor in front of Sarah. For a split second, she hesitated, unsure of what to do next. But as she crouched down to inspect the baby, her breath caught in her throat. The child was wrapped in a blanket embroidered with a symbol she recognized immediately, a symbol that carried a heartbreaking story she thought she had left behind. Her hands flew to her mouth as tears welled up in her eyes. "No, it can't be," she whispered. The lion let out a low rumble, almost like a sigh, and took a step back. Sarah's mind raced, piecing together fragments of a story she had tried to forget. She looked up at the lion, then back at the baby, her heart pounding harder with each passing second. What was the lion trying to tell her? And how was this baby connected to a secret she had buried deep within her heart? Sarah knew in that moment that her life, and the lives of everyone in that hospital, was about to change forever. But she had no idea just how deeply this encounter would shake her world. Sarah's hands trembled as she slowly reached for the baby. She hesitated for a moment, afraid that the lion might react, but the animal stayed completely still, watching her with a calm intensity. It didn't make a sound, didn't flinch. It just stood there, towering over her, as though it had entrusted her with something sacred. Carefully, Sarah picked up the baby, cradling the tiny bundle against her chest. The warmth of the child seeped through the blanket, grounding her in a moment that felt entirely surreal. Her colleagues stood frozen behind her, whispering nervously among themselves. "What's happening? Is that even real?" Someone called for help. But Sarah couldn't hear them anymore. All she could focus on was the baby in her arms. The little one stirred, its small hand peeking out from the blanket to grab at the air. The gesture was so delicate, so alive, it brought fresh tears to Sarah's eyes. The blanket. That symbol on the blanket. It felt like a key to a door she wasn't ready to open. Years ago, she had come across that very same pattern during her volunteer work at a nearby wildlife sanctuary. The sanctuary had been a refuge not just for animals, but for people who had nowhere else to turn. It was where Sarah had spent countless hours, finding purpose and peace after a personal tragedy she rarely spoke of. The pattern was unique, stitched into blankets gifted to newborns by a small group of women who worked tirelessly to support families in need. Sarah had once helped hand out those very blankets. But this one was different. She glanced back at the lion, her mind racing with questions. Why was this animal here? How did it even make it to the hospital without causing chaos along the way? And this baby, where had it come from? She searched the lion's eyes for answers, but they only deepened the mystery. There was no fear, no aggression, only a quiet urgency that seemed to say, "You need to understand." Sarah, a voice finally broke through the fog of her thoughts. It was Dr. Patel, the head physician on duty that day. His voice was low and firm, a calming presence amid the chaos. "Step back slowly. We need to get you and the baby to safety." "No," Sarah said, surprising even herself with the conviction in her voice. She held the baby closer, her body instinctively shielding it. "The lion isn't going to hurt us. It had brought the baby here for a reason." Dr. Patel frowned, his eyes flicking nervously to the lion, then back to Sarah. "That's insane. It's a wild animal. It's dangerous. We need to get everyone out of here before something happens." Sarah shook her head, her gaze never leaving the lion. "Look at it. Does it look like it's here to attack anyone? It could have done that already, but it didn't. It came here for help." The lion let out a soft huff, almost as if it understood her words. Its massive chest rose and fell in a slow rhythm, its tail flicking lazily behind it. It looked strangely peaceful. Yet there was an undeniable weight in the air, a tension that hinted at something far bigger than any of them could comprehend. The baby let out a tiny cry, snapping Sarah's attention back to the present. She rocked the child gently, murmuring soothing words. "Sure, it's okay. You're safe now," she whispered, though she wasn't entirely sure who she was trying to reassure, the baby or herself. Dr. Patel motioned for the security guards to hold back. "Fine," he said cautiously. "But if that thing makes one wrong move—" "It won't," Sarah interrupted, her voice steadier now. "Trust me." The baby's cry softened, and for a moment, the room was eerily quiet. The lion shifted its weight, glancing toward the hallway as though urging them to follow. Sarah noticed the subtle gesture and felt a strange pull in her chest. "It wants us to go somewhere," she said, looking at Dr. Patel. "You can't be serious," he replied, his eyes narrowing. "I am," Sarah insisted. "There's something we're not seeing here. Something important." Against his better judgment, Dr. Patel nodded.
"All right.
"But we're not going alone. Security stays close, and the minute this goes sideways, we're evacuating." Sarah agreed, though deep down, she didn't believe it would come to that. There was something extraordinary about this lion, something that defied all logic, but felt undeniably real. She followed as the lion turned and began walking down the hallway, its massive paws patting silently on the tiled floor. The baby nestled against her chest, its small breaths steady and warm. The hospital staff parted like waves as the lion passed, their eyes wide with fear and fascination. Some whispered prayers, others filmed on their phones, capturing a moment they would struggle to explain later. But Sarah didn't care about any of that. She was focused on the path ahead. The lion led them to an elevator and stopped, waiting patiently. Dr. Patel hesitated. "We're not seriously getting in there with." "Just trust it," Sarah said. Her voice carried an authority that surprised even her. She stepped into the elevator with the lion, cradling the baby protectively. After a moment's hesitation, Dr. Patel and 2 security guards joined them. The ride up was silent, except for the soft ding of the elevator as it ascended. Sarah's heart raced with anticipation. Where was the lion taking them?
And why?
She glanced down at the baby, its tiny fingers gripping the edge of the blanket. She couldn't shake the feeling that this child was the key to everything. When the elevator doors opened, the lion stepped out and padded down another hallway. Sarah followed, her mind a whirlwind of thoughts. Finally, they arrived at an unused wing of the hospital, a place Sarah hadn't been in years. It had been closed off for renovations that never seemed to happen, a forgotten corner of the building. The lion stopped in front of a door and turned to look at Sarah. Its gaze was steady, almost expectant. With a deep breath, Sarah stepped forward and pushed the door open. Inside was a room she didn't recognize, dimly lit, with a faint scent of something earthy, almost like the forest. In the center of the room was an old wooden chest, its surface carved with intricate patterns that looked oddly familiar. Sarah's pulse quickened as she approached the chest. She glanced back at the lion, which stood motionless in the doorway, watching her. Dr. Patel and the guards exchanged uneasy glances, but didn't interfere. Sarah set the baby down on a nearby table, making sure it was secure, and then knelt in front of the chest. Her fingers traced the carvings, and a wave of memories flooded her mind. The patterns matched the ones on the blanket, the ones from the sanctuary. But what was this doing here? And why had the lion brought her to it? With trembling hands, she opened the chest. Inside, she found a collection of items, a faded photograph, a small journal, and a piece of fabric that looked eerily similar to the baby's blanket. Her breath caught as she picked up the photo. It was a picture of a young woman holding a baby, smiling brightly. But it wasn't just any woman. It was her. Her mind reeled. How was this possible? Why was her past suddenly colliding with this unimaginable present? She turned to look at the lion, tears streaming down her face. "What does this mean?" she whispered. The lion let out a low rumble, stepping closer. Its eyes seemed to say everything and nothing all at once. And in that moment, Sarah realized she was standing on the edge of a truth she wasn't sure she was ready to face. Sarah sat back on her heels, clutching the photograph as 1,000 questions churned in her mind. She looked again at the smiling woman in the picture, her younger self. It was from a time when life was simpler, when the world hadn't yet shown her its cruelest side. But the baby in her arms, that wasn't possible. The child she had once held in that exact pose was gone, taken from her in the cruelest way imaginable. She had buried that pain, told herself to move forward, to survive. Yet here she was, staring at evidence that threatened to unravel everything. The lion stepped closer, its massive frame casting a shadow over the open chest. Sarah felt its presence like a force, grounding her in the moment even as her thoughts spiraled. Dr. Patel, standing stiffly in the corner, finally broke the silence. "Sarah, what's going on? Who's in that picture?" His voice was cautious but insistent, pulling her out of her daze. She hesitated, unsure of how to explain something she didn't fully understand herself. "It's me," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "But this picture doesn't make sense. It can't be real." "What do you mean it can't be real?" Dr. Patel pressed, glancing nervously between Sarah and the lion, which still hadn't made a sound. Sarah's hands tightened around the edges of the photo. She felt exposed, vulnerable, like her deepest scars were being dragged into the open. "The baby in this picture, my baby, she died years ago," she said, her voice breaking. "This photo, this shouldn't exist." A heavy silence filled the room. Dr. Patel's expression softened, his skepticism giving way to concern. The security guards exchanged uneasy glances but stayed quiet, their hands resting on their radios as if ready to act at a moment's notice. The lion, however, remained calm, its unblinking gaze fixed on Sarah. Sarah's mind raced, trying to make sense of the impossible. Was this some kind of cruel joke? A mistake? Or something far more inexplicable? Her eyes darted to the journal in the chest. She hesitated for a moment before picking it up and flipping through its pages. The handwriting was unfamiliar, yet the words felt oddly personal. The entries were brief, almost cryptic. "The bond cannot be broken," one read. Another said, "When the time comes, the truth will find her." And then there was a single sentence that sent chills down her spine. "A mother's love transcends all boundaries." Tears blurred her vision as she set the journal aside. None of this made sense, yet it felt deeply, hauntingly significant. She turned back to the baby, still lying peacefully on the table, wrapped in that familiar blanket. The child's presence was both comforting and unsettling, like a living echo of a past she thought she'd left behind. Dr. Patel cleared his throat, his tone more cautious now. "Sarah, if there's something we need to know, anything that could help us understand what's happening, you need to tell us." "I don't know what's happening," she admitted, her voice shaking. "All I know is that this lion brought this baby here for a reason. And somehow it's connected to me, to my past." As if responding to her words, the lion stepped closer, its eyes locking onto hers. Sarah felt an overwhelming urge to reach out, to place her hand on its massive head. It was an irrational impulse, but one she couldn't ignore. Slowly, she extended her hand, her palm trembling as it hovered inches from the lion's fur. To her astonishment, the animal didn't pull away. Instead, it leaned into her touch, closing its eyes briefly as if in acknowledgement. The moment was profound, almost sacred. Sarah felt a strange warmth spread through her, a sense of connection she couldn't explain. It was as if the lion was sharing something with her, something unspoken but deeply important. Before she could process the feeling, a sudden noise shattered the quiet. The distant sound of voices echoed down the hallway, growing louder with each passing second. The hospital staff, who had been cautiously keeping their distance, had apparently decided that whatever was happening here was too strange to ignore. Sarah could hear footsteps approaching, the sharp clip of shoes on tile. Dr. Patel tensed. "We need to move. If they see this," he gestured to the lion. "There's no telling what they'll do." Sarah nodded, her heart pounding. She scooped up the baby, cradling it protectively, and turned back to the lion. "Where do we go?" she murmured, half to herself. The lion seemed to understand. It stepped toward the doorway, its movements deliberate and purposeful. Sarah followed without hesitation, trusting the animal in a way that defied all logic. Dr. Patel and the security guards trailed behind, their unease palpable. The lion led them through the hospital's deserted wing, weaving through dimly lit hallways and past closed doors. Sarah's mind raced with questions, but there was no time to dwell on them. All she could do was keep moving, her instincts guiding her now more than ever. Finally, they reached a stairwell at the far end of the wing. The lion stopped, turning to look at Sarah as if to say, "This is the way." She hesitated for only a moment before stepping through the door. The lion followed, its massive form somehow moving gracefully in the confined space. The group descended the stairs in silence, their footsteps echoing in the narrow stairwell. Sarah's grip on the baby tightened as they reached the basement level. The air here was cooler, heavier, with a faint hum of machinery in the background. The lion led them to a door marked maintenance, nudging it open with its nose. Inside was a small, dimly lit room cluttered with old equipment and tools. It looked unremarkable at first glance, but the lion moved with purpose, guiding them to a section of the wall that seemed oddly out of place. The animal raised a massive paw and tapped against the wall, its claws clicking softly against the surface. Dr. Patel frowned. "What's it doing?" Before Sarah could respond, she noticed something, a faint outline in the wall, barely visible in the dim light. It was a door, hidden but unmistakable. Her pulse quickened as she stepped closer. The lion let out a low rumble, almost as if urging her on. Sarah hesitated, then reached out to touch the hidden door. To her surprise, it gave way easily, swinging open to reveal a narrow passageway. The air inside was cool and still, carrying a faint, earthy scent. She turned back to Dr. Patel, her eyes wide with both fear and wonder. "I think we're supposed to go in." "This is insane," he muttered, but he didn't stop her. The lion stepped into the passageway first, its powerful frame moving with a grace that seemed almost otherworldly. Sarah followed, the baby still cradled securely in her arms. As they ventured deeper into the passage, the sense of mystery only grew. The walls were lined with strange markings, symbols that looked ancient and unfamiliar. Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into something far bigger than any of them could comprehend. The passage eventually opened into a cavernous room, its walls glowing faintly with an otherworldly light. At the center of the room was a stone pedestal, and on it rested a small, intricately carved box. The lion stopped in front of the pedestal, turning to look at Sarah with an expression that seemed almost expectant. Her heart pounded as she approached the box, her mind racing with questions she couldn't begin to answer. What was inside? And how was it connected to everything that had led them here? She reached out, her fingers brushing against the cool surface of the box, and felt a strange energy ripple through her. But before she could open it, the baby in her arms let out a soft, plaintive cry, pulling her attention back. The sound echoed in the cavern, a fragile, human reminder in the midst of the surreal. Sarah looked down at the child, her breath catching in her throat. And then, as if on cue, the lion let out a deep, resonant roar that seemed to shake the very walls of the room. The sound wasn't one of anger or fear. It was a call, a signal. For what? Sarah didn't know. But she had a feeling that whatever came next would change everything. The roar seemed to vibrate through Sarah's chest, reverberating in the cavernous space like an ancient song echoing across time. She froze, her hand still resting on the intricately carved box, her breath catching in her throat. The lion's call wasn't just a sound. It was a message, a signal that something was about to happen. The baby stirred in her arms, letting out another small cry that mingled with the lingering echoes of the roar. The moment felt alive, electric, as though the very air around them was charged with unseen energy. Dr. Patel stepped closer, his face pale and drawn. "Sarah," he said, his voice strained but steady, "I don't know what's going on here, but this is beyond anything we've ever dealt with. Are you sure we should be doing this?" Sarah turned to him, her eyes wide and filled with equal parts fear and determination. "I don't think we have a choice," she said softly. "Whatever this is, it's been waiting for us." For this moment, the lion stepped forward, its golden eyes locked on Sarah. Its movements were slow, deliberate, almost reverent. It nudged the pedestal gently with its massive head, then looked back at her, urging her to act. Sarah swallowed hard, her fingers brushing the surface of the box again. The carvings felt alive under her touch, as though they were pulsing faintly with an unseen rhythm. She glanced down at the baby in her arms, its tiny face calm and serene now. The child's presence grounded her, gave her the courage to take the next step. Slowly, she lifted the lid of the box. It opened without resistance, revealing a single, small object resting inside, a locket. The delicate piece of jewelry shimmered faintly in the dim light, its surface engraved with the same intricate patterns that adorned the baby's blanket and the chest in the hospital. Sarah's fingers trembled as she picked up the locket. The moment she touched it, a wave of warmth surged through her, filling her with a strange sense of familiarity. She turned it over in her hand, her heart racing as she noticed a tiny inscription etched onto the back. The words were simple, but they struck her like a lightning bolt. For Sarah. Always. Her knees felt weak, and she stumbled back slightly, clutching the locket tightly in her hand. This can't be real," she whispered, her voice barely audible. But the lion let out a low rumble, a sound that felt almost like reassurance. It wasn't comforting in a traditional sense. It was more like an acknowledgement, a confirmation that what she was feeling was real. Dr. Patel stepped forward, his eyes narrowing as he peered at the locket. "What does it say?" he asked, his voice thick with curiosity and concern. Sarah hesitated, unsure of how to explain. "It's addressed to me," she said finally, her voice trembling. "But I don't understand. How could it be here? How could any of this be happening?" Before Dr. Patel could respond, the baby in Sarah's arms let out a soft coo, its tiny fingers reaching up to grasp at the locket. The movement was so deliberate, so precise, that it took Sarah's breath away. She held the locket closer to the child, watching in stunned silence as the baby's small hand closed around it. The moment the baby touched the locket, the cavern seemed to shift. The faint glow along the walls grew brighter, illuminating the intricate symbols that lined the space. Sarah's heart pounded as the air grew heavier, humming with an energy that was impossible to ignore. She felt a deep pull in her chest, as though some unseen force was drawing her closer to the truth. The lion stepped back, its gaze fixed on the pedestal. It let out another low rumble, its tail swishing behind it in a slow, deliberate arc. Sarah turned to follow its gaze and saw something she hadn't noticed before. A faint, circular pattern carved into the floor around the pedestal. The symbols seemed to ripple and shift as the light danced across them, their meaning just out of reach. Dr. Patel took a step back, his face pale. "This is not natural," he said, his voice shaking. "Sarah, I don't know what's happening, but we need to leave.
Now?
But Sarah shook her head, her eyes locked on the glowing symbols. "No," she said firmly. "We can't leave. Not yet. There's something here, something we're meant to find." The baby let out another soft coo, its tiny hand still clutching the locket. Sarah felt a surge of emotion, a mix of fear and hope so intense it brought tears to her eyes. She looked at the lion, which had moved to the edge of the circle, its golden eyes watching her with an almost human intensity. "What do you want me to do?" she whispered, her voice breaking. The lion didn't respond, but its gaze never wavered. Sarah felt the weight of its expectation, the sense that it was waiting for her to take the next step. The energy in the room seemed to build, the hum growing louder and more insistent. Sarah looked down at the baby, then at the locket in her hand. A realization began to form in the back of her mind, one that felt both impossible and undeniable. The locket wasn't just a piece of jewelry, it was a key. Her breath caught as she stepped closer to the pedestal, her hands shaking. She glanced back at Dr. Patel, who stood frozen in place, his expression a mix of fear and disbelief. "Whatever happens," she said softly, "thank you for staying." He didn't respond, but his presence was enough. Sarah took a deep breath and placed the locket into a small indentation at the center of the pedestal. The moment it clicked into place, the room seemed to come alive. The glow along the walls intensified, filling the space with a warm, golden light. The symbols on the floor began to move, shifting and swirling like a living tapestry. The baby let out a delighted laugh, its tiny voice echoing in the cavern. Sarah felt a tear slide down her cheek as she looked down at the child, her heart swelling with an emotion she couldn't quite name. The lion let out a soft chuff, its tail swishing behind it as it stepped back, giving Sarah and the baby space. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the light dimmed. The room fell silent, the symbols fading back into stillness. Sarah stood frozen, her heart racing as she waited for something, anything, to happen. The baby in her arms cooed softly, its small fingers reaching up to touch her face. Sarah looked down, her breath catching as she saw the child's eyes. They were bright and clear, filled with an unspoken knowing that made her chest ache. In that moment, she realized that the baby wasn't just a symbol of her past, it was the key to her future. But before she could fully process the thought, a low, resonant growl echoed through the cavern. The lion stepped forward, its gaze shifting toward the far end of the room. Sarah followed its line of sight, her stomach tightening as she saw a shadow moving in the darkness. Someone or something was coming, and whatever it was, she had a feeling it would bring the answers she had been searching for and more questions than she was ready to face. The shadow at the far end of the room grew larger, more defined, as it moved toward them. Sarah's heart pounded, every instinct in her body screaming at her to protect the baby. The lion, now standing beside her, let out a low, rumbling growl, a warning to whatever approached. Dr. Patel stepped closer to Sarah, his eyes darting nervously between the shadow and the glowing symbols that had just gone dim. He didn't say a word, but the tension in his posture spoke volumes. Out of the darkness emerged a figure cloaked in a flowing robe, its face obscured by a deep hood. The figure moved slowly, deliberately, each step echoing in the cavernous room. Sarah tightened her grip on the baby, her mind racing. Who was this? And what did they want? The figure stopped a few feet away, lifting its head slightly. Though the hood still shrouded most of its face, Sarah could see the faint glint of eyes watching her intently. The figure raised a hand, palm open, as if to signal peace. The lion, though still tense, didn't move, its growl fading into silence. "Sarah," the figure said, its voice soft yet resonant. It was neither threatening nor reassuring, just calm, steady. "You've come far. You've faced the past and embraced the unknown. Now the final choice is yours." Sarah's breath caught. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice trembling. "And what is all of this? Why me?" The figure tilted its head slightly, as if contemplating her question. "I am a keeper," it said simply. "A guide for those who are meant to walk this path. And as for why you, that answer lies within you." "That's not an answer," Sarah shot back, her frustration bubbling to the surface. "I've been dragged into something I don't understand, and now you're telling me it's up to me to figure it out?" The figure extended its hand toward her, palm up. In its center was a faintly glowing orb, swirling with light and shadow. "The child you hold is a bridge," it said, "between what was and what can be. The locket you placed opened the way, but the choice remains yours. You can leave now, return to the life you've known, and this chapter will close. Or you can take the leap, and everything will change." Sarah's eyes darted between the glowing orb, the baby in her arms, and the lion standing protectively at her side. "Change how?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The figure lowered its hand, the orb's glow fading slightly. "The child is not just a part of your past," it said. "She is your future. A chance to mend what was broken, to heal what was lost. But with that comes responsibility, a path filled with uncertainty and sacrifice. The choice is yours to make." The baby let out a soft coo, its tiny fingers reaching up towards Sarah's face. She looked down, tears welling in her eyes. How could she choose? The idea of walking away, of leaving the child behind, was unbearable. But stepping into the unknown was equally terrifying. She had spent years burying her pain, convincing herself that she had moved on. Yet here it was, staring her in the face, demanding her attention. The lion let out a low, encouraging sound, nudging her gently with its massive head. Sarah looked at it, and in its golden eyes, she saw something that steadied her: trust.
Faith.
She took a deep breath, her heart hammering in her chest. "I'll do it," she said finally, her voice trembling but resolute. "I'll take the leap." The figure inclined its head, as if in acknowledgement. "Then hold the child close," it said. "And prepare yourself." Before Sarah could ask what it meant, the cavern began to tremble. The symbols along the walls and floor flared to life, their glow brighter than ever. The lion stepped back, its eyes fixed on Sarah, while Dr. Patel stood frozen, his face a mask of awe and fear. The baby let out a delighted laugh, its tiny hands reaching toward the glowing symbols. Sarah held the child tightly, her breath catching as the light swirled around them, enveloping them in a cocoon of warmth and energy. The locket, still nestled on the pedestal, began to pulse in time with the glowing symbols, its rhythm steady and hypnotic. And then, just as the light reached its peak, everything went still. The cavern fell silent, the glow fading to a soft, steady shimmer. Sarah blinked, her vision adjusting, and realized they were no longer in the cavern. They were standing in a lush, sunlit meadow, the air filled with the sound of birdsong and a gentle breeze. The figure was gone, but the lion stood beside her, its golden eyes watching her with quiet intensity. Dr. Patel was there too, his expression one of utter disbelief. Sarah looked down at the baby, who was smiling up at her, its tiny face glowing with joy. For a moment, everything felt peaceful. But then Sarah noticed something, a faint shimmer in the distance, like a mirage. As she stepped closer, the image became clearer. It was a house, familiar yet strange, its windows glowing warmly. And standing in the doorway was a figure she recognized instantly. It was her. Or rather, it was a version of her, a younger Sarah, holding a baby in her arms. The sight took her breath away. She felt a rush of emotions, grief, joy, confusion, all colliding at once. "What is this?" she whispered, her voice shaking. The lion let out a soft chuff, its gaze steady. Sarah turned to it, searching its eyes for answers. But before she could speak, the shimmering image began to fade, leaving her standing in the meadow with the baby in her arms. And then she understood. The past wasn't something to erase or forget. It was a part of her, woven into the fabric of who she was. The child she held wasn't just a bridge to the future. It was a reminder that love, even in the face of loss, could transcend time and space. As the realization settled over her, the lion let out one final roar, its sound carrying across the meadow like a proclamation. Sarah stood tall, her heart steady, her mind clear. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in years, she felt ready to face it. And then, as the sun dipped low on the horizon, the meadow began to dissolve, the world shifting back into the familiar confines of the hospital. Sarah blinked, her breath catching as she found herself standing in the room where it had all begun. The lion was gone, and so was the glowing pedestal. But the baby was still in her arms, its tiny hand clutching the locket. Dr. Patel let out a shaky breath, his voice barely above a whisper. "Sarah, what just happened?" She looked at him, a small, knowing smile on her lips. "I think," she said softly, "we just got a second chance." As she cradled the baby close, she felt a quiet certainty settle over her. The journey wasn't over, not by a long shot. But whatever lay ahead, she knew she wouldn't face it alone. The hospital room felt eerily quiet after the whirlwind of events that had just transpired. Sarah stood there, still holding the baby, her thoughts racing as the reality of everything began to settle over her. The sterile white walls of the room were a stark contrast to the vibrant, otherworldly meadow they had just left behind, but something had shifted inside her. The weight of grief, confusion, and guilt that she had carried for years felt lighter now, like a heavy fog finally lifting to reveal a clear sky. Dr. Patel sat in a chair nearby, his face still pale and his hands trembling slightly. He was staring at the baby, his expression a mix of disbelief and awe. "Sarah," he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper, "are we just going to pretend that didn't happen? That any of it didn't happen?" She gave him a faint smile, rocking the baby gently as she replied, "I don't think we can pretend, even if we wanted to. Whatever happened back there, it was real. As real as this moment right now." Dr. Patel rubbed his temples, trying to process everything. "But the lion, the light, the meadow, it doesn't make sense. And the baby? How is this child connected to you? How is any of this possible?" Sarah looked down at the baby, her heart swelling with a mix of tenderness and wonder. "I don't have all the answers," she admitted. "But I do know this. That child is here for a reason. She's connected to me, to my past, in ways I can't fully explain. Maybe she's a second chance, or maybe she's a reminder that the things we lose are never truly gone." Dr. Patel sighed, leaning back in his chair. "And the lion?" he asked. "What was it? Why did it bring the baby here in the first place?" Sarah thought back to the lion, its golden eyes filled with an intelligence and understanding that had both unsettled and comforted her. "I think the lion was a guardian," she said after a moment. "A protector, guiding us towards something we needed to face. Maybe it wasn't about the baby at all. Maybe it was about me. About confronting my past and making peace with it." Dr. Patel nodded slowly, though it was clear he was still grappling with the enormity of what they had experienced. "What happens now?" he asked. "What do you do with the babies?" Sarah took a deep breath, her mind turning to the locket still clutched in the baby's tiny hand. She gently pried it loose, holding it up to the light. The intricate carvings seemed to glow faintly, as though imbued with some residual energy from the cavern. Inside, she found a photograph, one she hadn't noticed before. It was a picture of her younger self, holding a newborn baby. Tears welled in her eyes as she stared at it, her chest tightening with a flood of memories. "I think she's meant to be with me," Sarah said softly. "I don't know why or how, but I feel it. She's part of my story now." Dr. Patel watched her for a moment, then nodded. "If anyone can figure out what to do next, it's you," he said, his voice filled with quiet confidence. "But Sarah, promise me you'll be careful. Whatever brought that baby here, whatever brought us into that cavern, it's bigger than us. There's more to this than we understand." "I know," she said, her gaze steady. "But I also know I can't walk away from this. Not now." Over the next few days, Sarah began the delicate process of adjusting to her new reality. The baby, whom she decided to call Grace, quickly became the center of her world. Despite everything, Grace was a remarkably calm and joyful child, her laughter filling the quiet corners of Sarah's apartment and her presence bringing an unexpected warmth that Sarah hadn't felt in years. Word of the lion's mysterious appearance at the hospital spread quickly, capturing the attention of both local media and curious onlookers. But by the time anyone arrived to investigate, the lion was gone, leaving behind only the echoes of its roars and the unanswered questions it had brought with it. Dr. Patel and Sarah agreed to keep the details of what had happened in the cavern to themselves, knowing that trying to explain it would only invite more confusion and scrutiny. As the weeks turned into months, Sarah found herself reflecting often on the journey that had brought her to this point. Grace's presence in her life was a constant reminder of the unexpected ways the past could shape the present, and how even the most painful experiences could lead to something beautiful. She began to see her own story not as a series of losses and regrets, but as a tapestry woven with moments of love, resilience, and hope. One day, as Sarah and Grace sat together in the park, the sunlight filtering through the trees, she felt a sense of peace that had eluded her for years. Watching Grace play, her tiny hands reaching for dandelions and her laughter ringing out like music, Sarah realized that the journey wasn't about finding answers or solving mysteries. It was about embracing the life in front of her, the love that had found its way back to her in the most unexpected form. But as much as Sarah wanted to move forward, she couldn't entirely forget the figure in the cavern, the glowing orb, or the lion's piercing gaze. There was still a part of her that wondered what it all meant, and whether her story with Grace was just the beginning of something even greater. She often found herself staring at the locket, its intricate carvings a silent reminder of the mysteries she had yet to unravel. One evening, as she tucked Grace into bed, Sarah noticed something unusual. The locket, which had been sitting on her bedside table, was glowing faintly in the dim light. Her heart quickened as she picked it up, turning it over in her hands. The glow grew brighter, and for a brief moment, Sarah thought she could hear the distant roar of the lion. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the glow faded, leaving the locket cool and still in her hands. Sarah's breath caught, her mind racing with possibilities. Was it a sign? A message? Or simply a reminder that some mysteries were meant to remain unsolved? She didn't have the answers, but she realized she didn't need them. The journey she had been on had taught her that life was less about understanding every twist and turn and more about embracing the moments that defined her, the people who loved her, and the paths she chose to walk. As Sarah stood by Grace's crib, watching her daughter sleep peacefully, she felt a quiet resolve settle over her. Whatever the future held, she would face it with courage and an open heart. And no matter what mysteries lay ahead, she knew one thing for certain. She and Grace were exactly where they were meant to be. The lion's roar may have been silenced, but its message lingered in Sarah's heart, a reminder that the greatest journeys often begin with the most unexpected steps. And as the moonlight streamed through the window, casting a soft glow over the room, Sarah smiled, ready for whatever came next.